Leonita pushed the worn-out shopping cart down the narrow alleyway, its squeaky wheels protesting with every bump on the uneven cobblestones. The early morning air was crisp, tinged with the faint smell of baking bread from a nearby panaderia, a stark contrast to the stench of decay that lingered around the dumpsters. Leonita's remaining hand, roughened by years of hard labor, gripped the cart handle tightly. Her eyes, once bright with the hopes of youth, were now dulled by the weight of survival. She stopped by a large green dumpster, pausing to catch her breath. The sun had just begun to rise, casting a golden hue over the city of Guadalajara, but the warmth of the morning light did little to alleviate the cold that settled deep within her bones. Leonita was in her mid-40s, not yet old, but the years had been unkind. The lines etched into her face spoke of loss and struggle, her once smooth skin now weathered by time and hardship. Her clothes, a patchwork of fabric salvaged from other people's cast-offs, hung loosely on her thin frame, a body shaped by years of malnourishment and relentless work. She hoisted herself up onto the edge of the dumpster, using her knee for balance, and began to sift through the trash with the precision of someone who had done this countless times before. Plastic bottles, aluminum cans, these were the treasures she sought, small tokens that could be exchanged for a few pesos at the recycling center. As she worked, her mind drifted to memories of a different life, a life where she had been whole, where she had been someone's wife, someone's daughter. There had been a time when she had a job in a small textile factory, a place where the hum of sewing machines filled the air and the smell of fresh fabric was a comfort. But that life had been snatched away in an instant, an accident that left her without her right arm and, in the eyes of her family, without value. They had promised to care for her, but pity soon turned to resentment, and Leonita found herself abandoned, left to fend for herself, in a world that had no place for the disabled and destitute. As she dug deeper into the pile of refuse, the faint cry of a baby cut through the morning stillness. Leonita froze, her heart skipping a beat. She strained to listen, thinking perhaps it was just her imagination playing tricks on her. But the cry came again, weak and desperate. She abandoned the can she had collected and followed the sound, her breath quickening with a mix of fear and anticipation. Leonita's eyes widened as she spotted a bundle tucked away behind a stack of broken crates. She approached cautiously, her heart pounding in her chest. The cries grew louder, more insistent as she reached out with trembling fingers to pull back the layers of dirty fabric. There, nestled among the filth, was a tiny baby, its face scrunched up in distress, its small fists clenched in hunger and cold. For a moment Leonita could only stare, her mind struggling to process what she was seeing. How could someone do this? How could they leave a child to die in a place like this? The questions swirled in her head, but she had no answers, only a growing sense of urgency. She knew she had to act, and quickly. With a gentleness that belied her rough exterior, Leonita scooped the baby into her arms. The infant's cries softened as it felt the warmth of her body, its tiny mouth rooting against her chest in search of food. Leonita's heart ached as she realized just how helpless this little one was, utterly dependent on the kindness of strangers, just as she had been once. A wave of determination washed over her. This child had come to her for a reason, and she would not let it down. In that moment, Leonita felt something she hadn't felt in years, a sense of purpose. She held the baby close, her body shielding it from the cold morning air, and began to walk. She didn't know where she was going, but she knew she couldn't stay here. As she moved through the quiet streets, the city slowly coming to life around her, Leonita's thoughts raced. How would she care for this child? She had nothing, no money, no home, no family. But she had survived this long on sheer will, And she would find a way to survive for this child, too. The road ahead would be difficult, but Leonita had faced difficult roads before. This time, she wouldn't be walking it alone. The baby stirred in her arms, its small face relaxing into a peaceful sleep. Leonita looked down at the child, and despite the uncertainty that lay ahead, a small smile tugged at the corners of her mouth. Leonita pushed aside the worn fabric that served as a makeshift door to her shelter, stepping carefully over the uneven ground. The shelter, if it could even be called that, was a small, rickety structure made from salvaged wood and scraps of cloth, pieced together with determination, more than skill. It offered little against the elements, but it was the only home she had. As she entered, she instinctively cradled the small bundle closer to her chest, shielding the baby from the chill that permeated the air. The interior of the shelter was cramped and sparsely furnished. A thin, tattered blanket lay in one corner, serving as both bed and covering. A few plastic containers held the meager belongings she had managed to collect over the years, mostly items that others had discarded without a second thought. A small metal can, blackened by years of use, sat near the entrance, filled with rainwater she had collected for drinking and washing. Leonita knelt down on the hard-packed dirt floor, carefully lowering the baby onto the blanket. The child's eyes remained closed, its tiny chest rising and falling with each labored breath. Leonita watched, her heart heavy with a mixture of fear and determination. She had no idea how to care for a baby, especially one so fragile, but she knew she had to try. She stood and surveyed the small space, trying to figure out how she could make it more comfortable for the child. Her gaze fell on a pile of old newspapers stacked in a corner. They wouldn't provide much warmth, but they might add a bit of insulation against the cold ground. She gathered them up and laid them carefully beneath the blanket, then used the remaining scraps of cloth she had to create a makeshift nest around the baby. It wasn't much, but it was the best she could do. As the day wore on, Leonita set about finding food. She knew that the child needed more than the scraps she usually scavenged for herself. Her own stomach growled in protest, but she ignored it, focusing instead on the task at hand. She ventured out into the city, weaving through alleys and side streets, searching for anything that might sustain the child. Hours later, she returned with a small bottle of milk she'd managed to acquire through sheer persistence and a bit of pleading with a sympathetic vendor. She sat down beside the baby, gently lifting it into her arms. The child stirred, its eyes fluttering open for a brief moment before closing again. Leonita carefully fed the baby, her hands trembling slightly as she held the bottle. For the first time in years, she felt a sense of purpose, a reason to keep going, to fight against the relentless tide of despair that had threatened to consume her for so long. Days turned into weeks, and Leonita's life slowly began to revolve around the tiny child she had found. Each morning she would wake to the sound of the baby's soft breathing, a reminder that she was no longer alone. The routines of survival, scavenging, finding water, staying warm, took on new meaning, as she now did them not just for herself, but for the life that depended on her. Leonita found herself talking to the baby as she worked, her voice soft and soothing, though the child was too young to understand. "We'll make it, you and I," she would say, her words more a promise to herself than to the child. "I won't let anything happen to you." At night, when the city had quieted and the cold settled in, Leonita would sit by the baby, watching as it slept. She often found herself lost in thought, reflecting on the twist of fate that had brought the child into her life. The darkness that had once enveloped her seemed to be receding, replaced by a small but growing light. It was on one such night that Leonita made a decision. As she sat beside the sleeping child, she realized that she could no longer think of the baby as just a nameless orphan. The child had become more than that. She had become a part of Leonita's life, a beacon of hope in a world that had otherwise lost its color. She reached out and gently touched the baby's cheek, feeling the warmth of the child's skin beneath her fingers. "You need a name," she whispered, her voice barely audible in the stillness of the night. The baby stirred slightly, as if in response. Leonita smiled, a rare, genuine smile that hadn't graced her face in years. "Saul," she said softly, the name forming naturally on her lips. "I'll call you Saul. You're my light, my little son." Leonita felt a deep sense of peace as she uttered the name. Saul had brought light into her life, dispelling the shadows that had lingered for so long. And in that moment, Leonita made a silent vow to protect the child, to nurture and care for her with every ounce of strength she had left. Saul was more than just a baby. She was a second chance, a reason to believe in a better tomorrow. As Leonita settled down beside Saul, pulling the blanket over both of them to ward off the night's chill, she knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, she would face them with courage. Saul had given her that. The little son had given her the will to fight, to survive, and to hope once again. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows through the narrow streets of Guadalajara as Leonita trudged forward. Saul cradled securely in her arms. The child had fallen asleep, her tiny fist clutching a piece of Leonita's tattered shawl. The city buzzed around them, oblivious to the quiet desperation that marked Leonita's every step. She had spent the day moving from place to place, seeking the kind of help that seemed increasingly elusive. Leonita approached a modest church, its whitewashed walls glowing in the afternoon light. She hesitated at the entrance, feeling the weight of exhaustion pressing down on her. With a deep breath, she stepped inside. The cool air was a welcome relief, and for a moment she simply stood there, taking in the faint scent of incense and the soft murmurs of prayer. A priest, noticing her presence, approached. His gaze shifted from Leonita to the sleeping child in her arms, and a flicker of concern crossed his face. "Can I help you, Senora?" he asked, his voice kind but cautious. "I'm in need of food, and perhaps some clothes for the child," Leonita replied, her voice steady despite the weariness that clung to her words. "Anything you can spare would be a blessing." The priest nodded slowly, but there was hesitation in his eyes. "We have limited resources," he said gently. "Our donations go to many in need, and we must be careful with what we have. Perhaps you could return in a few days and we might have something to offer." Leonita's heart sank. She had heard similar words throughout the day, each time with the same polite refusal. But she had no choice but to keep trying. "Thank you, Father," she murmured, turning to leave. The priest watched her go, his brow furrowed in thought. But he didn't call her back. Outside, the streets were growing busier as evening approached. Leonita pulled the shawl tighter around Saul, shielding her from the cool breeze. She passed by a market, the vendors shouting their wares, the smells of cooked food and fresh produce filling the air. Her stomach growled, but she pushed the hunger aside. Saul came first. Leonita approached a stall where a woman was selling bread. The loaves were golden brown, and the smell was intoxicating. She stood for a moment, just beyond the edge of the stall, gathering the courage to ask for help once more. "Excuse me," Leonita began, her voice barely audible over the din of the market. The vendor glanced at her, her eyes narrowing as she took in Leonita's worn appearance and the baby in her arms. "I was wondering if you had any bread that you might be able to spare for the child." The vendor's expression hardened. "This is a business, not a charity," she snapped, turning away to serve a paying customer. Leonita's cheeks burned with shame, but she did not argue. She had no strength left for pride. She continued through the market, her steps growing heavier with each refusal, each dismissive glance. The sky darkened, and with it Leonita's hope began to fade. She wandered aimlessly, her mind a jumble of fear and fatigue, until she found herself standing in front of a small shop. The sign above the door read, "Ernesto's Tailor Shop." Leonita hesitated. She hadn't planned to stop here, but something about the place drew her in. The lights inside cast a warm glow, and through the window she could see a man bent over a sewing machine, his hands moving with practiced skill. Taking a deep breath, she pushed open the door. The man looked up, startled by the sudden intrusion. His eyes fell on Leonita, then on Saul, who had begun to stir. "What do you need?" he asked, his voice curt but not unkind. Leonita swallowed hard. "I need work," she said, her words coming out in a rush. "I can sew, mend clothes, anything you need. I just need something to feed the child." Ernesto leaned back in his chair, studying her. He saw the desperation in her eyes, the way she clutched the child protectively. He also saw the single arm she had left, the other sleeve pinned up against her shoulder. For a moment, he seemed to consider dismissing her like so many others had, but something stopped him. "Show me," he said, gesturing to a torn garment on the counter. "If you can mend this, we'll talk." Leonita set Saul down gently on a pile of fabric, her hands trembling as she picked up the needle and thread. She hadn't sewn since the accident, but her fingers remembered the motions, the rhythm of stitching. Slowly, methodically she began to work, the room falling silent except for the soft rustle of cloth and the steady tick of a nearby clock. Ernesto watched, his skepticism gradually giving way to something else, admiration. When she finished, he examined the garment, running his fingers over the stitches. It wasn't perfect, but it was far better than he had expected. "You can start tomorrow," he said gruffly, turning back to his sewing machine. "We'll see how it goes." The hum of the sewing machine filled the small tailor shop, its rhythmic sound blending with the occasional clink of scissors and the rustle of fabric. Leonita sat at the corner workbench, her one arm guiding the fabric carefully under the needle. The shop was modest, filled with the scent of old cloth and faint traces of dust, but it was alive with purpose. The walls were lined with shelves, each overflowing with spools of thread, boxes of buttons and stacks of fabric scraps. The space was cramped, yet it carried a warmth, a sense of belonging that Leonita hadn't felt in years. Ernesto, the shop's owner, moved briskly around the room, his sharp eyes always observing, always calculating. He had been skeptical at first. How could a woman with only one arm possibly keep up in a business as demanding as this? But watching her now, he couldn't help but feel a grudging respect. She was slow, yes, but precise, her movements deliberate and practiced. There was a quiet determination about her, a focus that he rarely saw in others. Leonita had been given the simplest tasks, mending tiers, sewing on buttons, repairing frayed hems. It was tedious work, the kind that most people would find beneath them, but to Leonita it was everything. Each stitch was a lifeline, each completed repair a small victory. The hours passed without her noticing, her world narrowed down to the needle and thread in her hand. As she worked, Leonita's thoughts often drifted to Saul. The little girl had become the center of her world, a beacon of light in the darkness that had enveloped her life for so long. Each day Leonita would bring home the scraps of fabric left over from the day's work. She would sit by the dim light of a candle, sewing tiny garments for Saul, her heart swelling with pride as she watched the child wear them, her eyes wide with delight at the new colors and patterns. In those quiet moments, Leonita felt something stir within her, a sense of purpose, a glimmer of hope that had been absent for so long. The work, simple as it was, reminded her that she still had value, that she could still create, still provide. The pain of her past, the loss of her arm, the abandonment by her family, all of it seemed to fade, replaced by the steady rhythm of the needle, the satisfaction of a job well done. One evening, after the last customer had left and the shop had grown quiet, Ernesto approached her. He held out a pile of fabric, finer than the scraps she had been working with. "Try your hand at this," he said, his voice gruff but not unkind. "A customer ordered a dress. Let's see what you can do." Leonita looked at the fabric, then back at Ernesto. His expression was unreadable, but there was something in his eyes, a challenge perhaps, or maybe even trust. She nodded, taking the fabric carefully into her hands. It was a test, she knew, a chance to prove herself, and she wouldn't waste it. The following days were a blur of concentration and effort. Leonita spent every spare moment on the dress, her focus unwavering. The design was simple, but the fabric was delicate, and she took extra care with each seam, each fold. Ernesto watched her progress without comment, but she could sense his approval in the way he left her to work, undisturbed. When the dress was finally finished, Leonita laid it out on the table, smoothing out the wrinkles with a sense of quiet satisfaction. It wasn't perfect. She could see the small flaws, the places where her hand had faltered, but it was good. More than that, it was hers. She had created something beautiful, something that would bring joy to someone else. Ernesto inspected the dress, his hands moving over the fabric, checking the seams, the stitching. He nodded once, a small but significant gesture. "Good work," he said simply, before turning away to attend to other matters. The words were few, but they meant more to Leonita than she could express. She had passed the test, earned a place in the shop. And with that, her life began to take on a new rhythm. Each day brought new challenges, new tasks, and with them a growing sense of confidence. Ernesto began to trust her with more complex orders, and Leonita, in turn, found herself rediscovering the joy of creation, the pride that came from a job well done. At night, after Saul had fallen asleep, Leonita would sit by the candlelight, her hands busy with the small garments she made for the child. With each stitch, Leonita was stitching herself back together, finding the strength she had thought lost forever. And as she worked, she knew that in some small way she was being reborn through every thread, every seam, a woman reclaiming her place in the world, one piece of fabric at a time. The morning light filtered through the dusty windows of the tailor shop, casting long shadows across the floor as Leonita bent over her work. Her needle moved steadily, each stitch a small act of defiance against the life that had tried so hard to break her. The rhythmic hum of the sewing machine and the quiet rustle of fabric were her only companions, a familiar solace in a world that often felt too harsh, too unforgiving. But today, something felt different. An unease had settled in the pit of her stomach, a sense that the fragile peace she had built was about to be shattered. She dismissed it at first, chalking it up to the exhaustion that clung to her like a second skin. Yet, as the morning wore on, the feeling only grew stronger, gnawing at her nerves. It was just past midday when the door to the shop creaked open. Leonita glanced up, expecting to see a customer, but her heart stopped when she saw who stood there. Miguel. His name echoed in her mind like a curse. He hadn't changed much. The same sharp features, the same dark eyes that once held a promise of forever. But now those eyes were tinged with something else. Guilt, perhaps, or regret. Leonita's breath caught in her throat as the memories came flooding back, each one more painful than the last. She remembered the accident, the day her life had veered off course. The machine had caught her sleeve, pulling her hand into its relentless gears. The pain had been blinding, a white-hot agony that consumed her. But worse than the physical pain had been the look on Miguel's face when he realized what had happened, a mixture of horror and something she hadn't expected: revulsion. After that, things had changed between them. Miguel had grown distant, his affection turning to indifference, then to coldness. He no longer looked at her the way he once had, as if the loss of her arm had somehow made her less of a person, less of a woman. She had tried to reach out to him, to remind him of the love they had shared, but he had already begun to drift away, seeking comfort in the arms of another. And then, one day, he was gone. No explanation, no goodbye, just an empty space where he used to be. The void he left behind had nearly swallowed her whole, but somehow she had survived. She had learned to live with the loss, to carry the weight of his betrayal like a scar that would never fully heal. Now, standing before her, Miguel looked older, wearier. There was a sadness in his eyes that hadn't been there before, a heaviness that spoke of his own regrets. But Leonita couldn't bring herself to feel sympathy, not after everything. "What are you doing here?" Her voice came out steadier than she expected, but she could hear the tremor beneath the surface. Miguel hesitated, as if searching for the right words. "Leonita," he began, but she cut him off. "No." She straightened, setting down the fabric she had been working on. "You don't get to just walk in here and act like nothing happened. What do you want?" He sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. "I made mistakes," he admitted, his voice low. "I know I hurt you." "Hurt me?" Leonita's laugh was bitter, sharp. "You destroyed me, Miguel. You left me when I needed you most. And now you're back after all this time? What for? To ease your conscience?" His eyes met hers, and for a moment she saw a flicker of the man she had once loved. "I came to apologize," he said quietly. "I know it doesn't change anything, but I needed to say it. I'm sorry, Leonita. I truly am." She wanted to believe him, to let his words wash away the years of pain and resentment. But she couldn't. Too much had happened. Too much had been lost. And now there was Sul to consider. She couldn't let her guard down, not when the child's safety was at stake. "What do you really want, Miguel?" she asked again, her voice hardening. "Why now?" He looked away, unable to meet her gaze. I've been trying to make things right," he said, "but it's not just about me. I know about the child, Leonita. I know you're caring for her." Leonita's blood ran cold. "What about her?" she demanded, her heart pounding in her chest. I wanted to help," Miguel replied, his voice faltering. "I know I don't deserve it, but I want to do something good for once. Please, Leonita, let me help you." Leonita felt the old fear creeping back, mingling with her anger and confusion. She didn't trust him. How could she? But she couldn't ignore the possibility that he might be telling the truth. Sul's welfare came first, and if Miguel's intentions were genuine, she couldn't afford to dismiss him outright. But she couldn't forgive him either. Not yet. "You want to help?" she said, her tone cold. "Then stay away. Sul is my responsibility, not yours. You lost that right when you walked out on me." Miguel's shoulders sagged, but he nodded, understanding that this was all she would give him. "I'm sorry," he repeated, turning to leave. But before he stepped out the door, he paused, looking back at her one last time. "If you ever change your mind, I'll be around." Leonita watched him go, the tension slowly leaving her body. She didn't know if she could ever forgive him, but she knew one thing for certain. She wouldn't let the past destroy the future she was building for Sul. The shadows of the city seemed longer, darker, as Leonita walked the narrow streets with Saul tucked close to her chest. The evening air was cool, but a cold sweat clung to her skin. She couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching them, that unseen eyes followed her every move. It had started a few days ago, subtle, almost imperceptible signs that gnawed at her nerves, a lingering gaze from a passerby, the sound of footsteps echoing just a little too close behind them. At first, she had dismissed it as paranoia, the residue of her encounter with Miguel, but the feeling had grown, settling into her bones like a permanent chill. As she hurried back to their shelter, her heart pounded in her chest, each beat a warning. She glanced over her shoulder, half expecting to see a shadowy figure lurking in the distance. But the streets were empty, save for the occasional pedestrian rushing home. Still, the fear remained, gnawing at her from the inside out. When they finally reached the shelter, Leonita quickly slipped inside, bolting the door behind her. She set Sul down on their makeshift bed, her hands trembling as she fumbled to light a candle. The flickering flame cast long, dancing shadows across the walls, but it did little to ease the tension coiled tight within her. Leonita sank down beside Sul, who was blissfully unaware of the turmoil around her. The child's soft breathing was a small comfort, a reminder of the innocence she had to protect. But how could she protect Sul when she didn't even know what or who was threatening them? The days passed in a haze of anxiety. Leonita found herself glancing over her shoulder constantly, her senses on high alert. She began to notice more signs. Footsteps that seemed to echo too closely. Figures that lingered just a little too long before disappearing into the crowd. Each encounter tightened the knot of fear in her chest, a fear that she couldn't ignore any longer. She knew she had to do something. Staying in one place, in a shelter that could be easily found, was no longer safe. Leonita made the difficult decision to move, to find a new place to hide, somewhere far from the prying eyes that seemed to follow them. The move was exhausting, both physically and emotionally, but Leonita pushed through, driven by the fierce need to protect Sul. They found a new refuge, a dilapidated building on the outskirts of the city, where the air was thick with the scent of decay and abandonment. It was far from ideal, but it offered the anonymity Leonita desperately sought. She kept Sul close, limiting their outings to the bare minimum, avoiding contact with anyone who might remember them. But even in this new place, the sense of unease didn't leave her. It was as if the walls themselves were closing in, as if the darkness was alive, watching, waiting. Leonita's sleep was plagued by nightmares, her mind conjuring images of Sul being ripped away from her by unseen hands. She woke in the middle of the night, heart racing, eyes scanning the shadows for threats that weren't there. It was on one such night that she heard the knock at the door. It was soft, almost hesitant, but in the dead of night it was enough to send a jolt of terror through her. Leonita froze, her breath caught in her throat. Who could possibly know they were here? The knock came again, firmer this time. Leonita rose slowly, her mind racing. She grabbed the small knife she kept hidden under her pillow, her hand shaking as she approached the door. "Who is it?" she called, her voice barely above a whisper. "Leonita, it's me, Alba." The voice on the other side was calm, familiar, but it did nothing to quell the fear that gripped her. Alba. Miguel's mother, her former mother-in-law. What was she doing here? Leonita hesitated, then unbolted the door, opening it just a crack. Alba stood in the doorway, her face illuminated by the dim light of the candle Leonita held. She looked older than Leonita remembered, her features lined with worry, but her eyes were sharp, determined. "What do you want?" Leonita asked, her voice cold, wary. "Please let me in," Alba replied, her tone gentle but insistent. "I need to talk to you. It's about Saul." Leonita's heart skipped a beat. She stepped aside, allowing Alba to enter, but kept her distance, the knife still clutched in her hand. Alba's gaze fell on Saul, sleeping peacefully in the corner, and a softness came over her features. She turned back to Leonita, her expression serious. "Leonita, there's something you need to know. Saul, she's my granddaughter." The words hung in the air, heavy with shock. Leonita stared at Alba, unable to process what she had just heard. "What are you talking about?" she demanded, her voice trembling. "Saul is Miguel's daughter," Alba said quietly. "Maria, his wife, abandoned her, just like she abandoned him. I've been trying to find her ever since." Leonita felt the world tilt beneath her, the ground shifting as the truth sank in. Saul, her Saul, was not just any child. She was Miguel's blood, Alba's family. The realization left her reeling, her mind a whirlwind of questions and doubts. What did this mean for Saul? For her? She didn't know what to think, what to believe. All she knew was that her world had just been upended, and nothing would ever be the same again. The small apartment felt suffocating, the walls closing in as Alba's words hung heavy in the air. Leonita sat motionless, her hands clenched tightly in her lap, knuckles white from the pressure. The world she had carefully rebuilt, brick by fragile brick, seemed to crumble around her, each revelation tearing at the foundation she had fought so hard to lay. Alba's voice, steady but laced with sorrow, continued to weave the tragic tale of Miguel's life after he left Leonita. "He thought he had found happiness with Maria," Alba began, her gaze fixed on the floor as if the memories were too painful to look at directly. But it didn't take long for the cracks to show. Their marriage was built on a lie, on the illusion that they could outrun the past, but it followed them. Leonita's mind raced, trying to reconcile the image of Miguel she had clung to all these years with the man Alba described. He had hurt her deeply, but hearing how his own life had spiraled out of control after he left only deepened her confusion. It was as if she was seeing him for the first time, not as the man who had betrayed her, but as a flawed human being, broken in his own way. "And Saul?" Leonita's voice was barely a whisper, but it carried the weight of her heartache. "What happened to her?" Alba looked up, her eyes meeting Leonita's with a mixture of guilt and compassion. "Maria couldn't handle the responsibility," she said, her tone thick with regret. "She wasn't ready to be a mother. When things got tough, she left, took off in the middle of the night with nothing but her clothes and disappeared. And Saul, she left Saul behind, discarded like—" Alba couldn't finish the sentence. Leonita didn't need her to. She had already imagined the scene 1,000 times in the space of a few seconds, the helpless infant left alone, vulnerable, in a world that had already turned its back on her. Leonita felt the room tilt, a wave of dizziness washing over her. She gripped the edge of her chair, grounding herself in the physical world, but the emotional turmoil was harder to control. Saul, the child she had found, the one she had nursed back to health, had been abandoned not just once, but twice, by both her parents. She fought to keep her emotions in check, to not let the rising tide of anger and sorrow drown her. "How could anyone do that?" Leonita asked, her voice trembling with the effort to remain composed. How could they just leave her like that? Maria was young and scared, Alba replied, her voice tinged with a sadness that mirrored Leonita's. I'm not excusing what she did. There's no excuse for it. But she wasn't capable of being the mother Sol needed. And Miguel, well, by the time he found out it was too late. Sol was already gone, lost in the system, and Maria was nowhere to be found. The enormity of it all was too much to bear. Leonita's thoughts tumbled over each other, colliding in a chaotic mess. She had loved Sul as her own from the moment she found her, but now, knowing the truth, everything felt uncertain. Should she give Sul back to her biological family, the ones who had failed her so spectacularly? Could she, in good conscience, deny Sul the chance to know where she came from, who her father was? Alba seemed to sense the turmoil in Leonita's heart. Leonita, she said softly, leaning forward, I'm not here to take Sul away from you. I know how much you love her, and I can see how much she loves you. But I believe Sul deserves to know the truth, to know who she is, where she came from, and she deserves to meet her father, even if it's just once. Leonita closed her eyes, the conflict inside her raging like a storm. Every instinct told her to protect Sul, to shield her from any more pain. But what if keeping the truth from her caused even more damage? Sul was growing, becoming more aware of the world around her, and eventually she would have questions Leonita couldn't answer on her own. Would it be the right thing to do? Leonita asked, more to herself than to Alba. What if it hurts her? What if it brings back memories she's better off forgetting? There's no easy answer, Alba admitted. But what I do know is that Sul is stronger than we think, and she has you. Whatever happens, she'll have your love to see her through. The room fell silent, the enormity of the decision weighing heavily between them. Leonita knew that this was a turning point, one that would shape not just Sul's future, but her own. She couldn't ignore the truth, but she also couldn't make this decision lightly. After what felt like an eternity, Leonita finally spoke. I'll arrange a meeting, she said, her voice quiet, but firm. But it will be on my terms. I need to protect her, Alba. I can't risk losing her. Alba nodded, understanding in her eyes. I'll make sure Miguel knows that, she said. He doesn't want to lose her either. Leonita sat back, the decision made, but the uncertainty still gnawing at her. She would do what needed to be done, but the path ahead was filled with shadows. All she could do now was hope that the light of truth wouldn't be too harsh, that it wouldn't burn away the fragile bond she had built with the child she loved as her own. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the narrow alleyways as Leonita made her way through the city. The streets, bustling with life, seemed oblivious to the turmoil brewing within her. Each step felt heavier than the last, as if the weight of what she was about to do threatened to anchor her in place. But she pressed on, her resolve fueled by a mixture of duty and uncertainty. Leonita's destination was a small, dilapidated building near the outskirts of town. Another shelter, but one less frequented than the one she had taken Sul to. It was here that Miguel had been staying, a place far removed from the life he once knew, yet fitting for the man he had become. She found him seated on a worn bench outside, his head bowed, lost in thought. The lines on his face were deeper than she remembered, the once proud man now looking every bit the weary soul he had become. As she approached, he looked up, surprise flickering in his eyes, before it was replaced by something unreadable, perhaps hope, perhaps fear. Leonita, he greeted, standing up, his voice tinged with the roughness of exhaustion. She nodded, her expression guarded. "Miguel, we need to talk." He motioned for her to sit, but she shook her head. The air between them was thick with tension, and she needed the strength that standing provided. "I've thought about what you said, about wanting to help," Leonita began, her voice steady despite the turmoil within. "There's something you need to know before we go any further." Miguel frowned, concern etching deeper into his features. "What is it?" Leonita took a deep breath, steeling herself for the words she was about to say. Sol is your daughter." The silence that followed was deafening. Miguel's face went pale, his eyes wide with shock, as if the air had been knocked out of him. For a moment, he seemed incapable of speech, his mouth opening and closing as he struggled to process what he had just heard. My daughter," he finally managed to choke out, his voice barely more than a whisper. Leonita nodded, her own emotions threatening to overwhelm her. "Yes, Miguel. Sol is your child. Maria. She left her in the streets, abandoned her. I found her, and I've been raising her ever since." Miguel staggered back, his legs giving way beneath him as he sank to his knees. A low, guttural sound escaping his lips. His hands covered his face, and his body trembled with the force of his sobs. "My God, what have I done?" he muttered, his voice breaking with the weight of his guilt. Leonita watched him, her heart aching with a mixture of pity and anger. She had never seen him so broken, so vulnerable. The man who had once seemed so strong, so certain of himself, was now reduced to a figure of despair, crushed by the realization of what he had lost. After what felt like an eternity, Miguel finally looked up, his eyes red and swollen, tears streaking his face. "Leonita, I didn't know. I swear I didn't know," he pleaded, his voice trembling. "If I had known, I never would have left." The sincerity in his voice was unmistakable, but it did little to ease the pain that lingered in Leonita's heart. "You didn't know, because you never cared enough to find out," she replied, her tone laced with bitterness. "You abandoned me, Miguel. You left without a word, without a second thought. And now you expect me to just forgive you?" Miguel shook his head frantically, his hands clasping together as if in prayer. No, I don't expect that. I don't deserve your forgiveness, Leonita. But please, let me make it right. Let me be there for Sol. She's my daughter. She's all I have left." Leonita turned away, her thoughts racing. She had been prepared for his reaction, but seeing him like this, so desperate and full of regret, made the decision all the more difficult. She had raised Sol as her own, had protected her from the harsh realities of their world. To let Miguel back into their lives was a risk, one that could either heal the wounds of the past or tear them open again. But Sol had a right to know the truth, and Miguel, despite everything, had a right to be part of her life. It wasn't an easy decision, but it was the only one she could make. After a long moment of silence, Leonita turned back to face him. "I'll allow you to meet her," she said slowly, her voice firm but not unkind. "But on my terms. You will not hurt her, Miguel. If I see any sign that you're not the man you claim to be now, you will never see her again. Do you understand?" Miguel nodded fervently, relief washing over him. "I understand, Leonita. I swear I'll do whatever it takes. I'll prove to you that I can be the father she needs." Leonita gave a curt nod. "We'll arrange a meeting soon. But remember, this is about Sol. It's not about you, not about us. She comes first." With that, she turned and walked away, leaving Miguel kneeling on the ground, his heart filled with both dread and hope. For the first time in a long while, he had a chance to do something right. But he knew it would take more than words. It would take every ounce of strength and sincerity he had left. As Leonita made her way back to Saul, the weight of the decision she had made settled over her. The future was uncertain, but she had taken the first step toward it. And now, all she could do was hope that Miguel would prove himself worthy of the trust she had reluctantly given him. The park was quiet, a sanctuary of green in the middle of the bustling city. The sun filtered through the trees, casting dappled shadows on the ground, and the air was filled with the soft rustle of leaves. It was the kind of peaceful place that should have brought comfort, but instead, it only heightened the tension that clung to the small group gathered near an old wooden bench. Leonita sat beside Saul, her hand resting protectively on the child's shoulder. Saul's small fingers fidgeted with the edge of her dress, her eyes wide and filled with uncertainty. The little girl could sense the unease around her, the way the adults spoke in low, careful tones, the way they watched her as if something was about to happen, something she wasn't sure she wanted to understand. Across from them, Miguel stood awkwardly, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. Leonita cleared her throat, her voice steady but gentle as she spoke. "Saul, this is Miguel. He's your father." The words hung in the air, heavy and strange. Saul blinked, trying to process what she was hearing. Father. The word felt wrong, out of place. She had never needed a father. She had Leonita, and that was enough. But now, this man was standing before her, looking at her with eyes that were too much like her own. Miguel knelt down to Saul's level, his voice soft as he tried to bridge the gap that years of absence had created. "Saul, I know this is a lot to take in. I know you must be feeling scared or confused, but I want you to know that I've always thought about you. I've always cared." Saul stared at him, her small face scrunched up in concentration, as if trying to find the truth in his words. "Why didn't you come before?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Why did you leave me?" Miguel's face crumpled, pain flashing across his features. "It's complicated, Saul. I made mistakes, big ones. And because of those mistakes, I couldn't be there for you like I should have. But that doesn't mean I didn't love you." Leonita felt Saul stiffen beside her, the little girl's body language a clear sign of her internal conflict. "I don't need you," Saul said, her voice gaining strength, though it wavered with emotion. "I have Leonita. She's been my mum. She's the one who loves me." Miguel looked at Leonita, his eyes filled with regret and understanding. He nodded slowly, acknowledging the truth in Saul's words. "You're right," he said softly. "Leonita has been there for you when I wasn't. She's done everything a parent should do, and more. And I'm so grateful to her for that." He paused, searching for the right words, the words that might reach Saul's heart. "But I'm here now, Saul. I want to be part of your life if you'll let me. I know I can't change the past, but I want to be here for you in the future. I want to help, to be someone you can count on." Saul looked up at Leonita, her eyes pleading for reassurance, for some kind of answer to the storm of emotions swirling inside her. Leonita squeezed her shoulder gently, giving her a small nod of encouragement. "It's okay to feel what you're feeling, Saul. You don't have to decide anything right now. Just know that I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere." Tears welled up in Saul's eyes, and she turned back to Miguel, her voice small and uncertain. "Do you really love me?" Miguel's eyes glistened as he nodded. "Yes, Saul. I love you more than anything. I'm sorry I wasn't there when you needed me, but I want to make up for it. I want to show you that I mean it." There was a long, tense silence as Sewell wrestled with the emotions inside her. She had spent her short life thinking that Leonita was all she needed, that the world began and ended with the woman who had cared for her with unwavering devotion. But now, here was this man, a father she had never known, offering her a place in his life, offering love that she had never dared to expect. Finally, Sewell spoke, her voice trembling but determined. "I don't know if I can love you back, not yet, but I'll try." Miguel's breath caught, and he reached out tentatively, not wanting to push too far, too fast. "That's all I can ask for, Sewell. Thank you." Leonita watched them, a deep sense of relief mingling with the lingering worry in her heart. The house was small, but it was more than Leonita could have ever imagined. Nestled on the edge of town, it stood modestly among a row of similar homes, each with its own patch of grass and a narrow path leading to the front door. The exterior was painted a soft, welcoming shade of yellow, and flowers bloomed in the small garden out front, their colors vibrant against the backdrop of fresh greenery. Alba had arranged everything: the house, the move, even the furniture that now filled the rooms. It was simple, but it was theirs. A place where Leonita and Sewell could finally feel safe, where they could begin to rebuild their lives away from the shadows of the past. Leonita stood in the middle of the living room, her gaze sweeping over the space. The furniture was second-hand but well chosen, each piece placed with care. The sunlight filtered through the curtains, casting a warm glow that made the house feel alive, like a living thing welcoming them into its embrace. Sewell was exploring, her small footsteps echoing through the hallway as she peeked into each room with wide-eyed curiosity. There was a joy in her movements, a lightness that Leonita hadn't seen in a long time. It was as if the weight of everything they had been through was beginning to lift, allowing Sewell to be the child she was meant to be. Miguel arrived later that afternoon, carrying a box of groceries in one hand and a small toy in the other. He hesitated at the doorway, as if unsure of his place in this new world that was forming around them. But when Sewell spotted him, her face lit up, and she ran to him with a shy smile. "Is this for me?" she asked, her voice filled with hope as she eyed the toy. Miguel knelt down, handing it to her. "Yes, it's yours. I thought you might like it." Sewell took the toy, a small stuffed bear, and hugged it close. "Thank you," she said softly, and in that moment something shifted between them, a bridge beginning to form over the chasm that had separated them. Leonita watched from the kitchen, her hands busy preparing dinner, but her mind focused on the scene unfolding in the living room. She had been wary at first, hesitant to let Miguel back into their lives. But over the past few weeks, he had proven himself, little by little, with each gesture of kindness, each moment of patience. He had been there, quietly supporting her and Sewell, never pushing, never demanding, just there, ready to help when needed. The tension between them hadn't disappeared overnight. There were still moments of doubt, of unspoken fears, but they were learning to trust each other, to work together for Sewell's sake. Miguel had shown that he was committed, that he was willing to put in the effort to be a part of their lives. And slowly, Leonita had begun to let down her guard. Dinner that evening was a simple affair, rice, beans, and grilled vegetables, but it was shared around a table with laughter and conversation that felt natural, unforced. Sewell talked about her day, about the things she had discovered in the new house, her voice animated and full of life. Miguel listened intently, his eyes softening as he watched her, a look of quiet contentment on his face. As they cleared the table, Miguel offered to help with the dishes. Leonita nodded, passing him a towel without a word, and they worked side by side in comfortable silence. The routine was new, but it felt right, like a rhythm they were slowly finding together. Later, as the evening wore on and Saul grew sleepy, Leonita tucked her into bed, pulling the covers up to her chin. Saul clutched the stuffed bear to her chest, her eyes already heavy with sleep. "Are we a family now?" Saul asked, her voice drowsy but filled with curiosity. Leonita smiled, brushing a strand of hair from Saul's forehead. "Yes, Saul, we're a family. Even with Miguel." Saul's eyes fluttered open briefly, searching Leonita's face for confirmation. "Even with Miguel," Leonita replied, her voice gentle but firm. "He's part of our family too." Satisfied, Saul nodded and closed her eyes, drifting off to sleep. Leonita watched her for a moment longer, feeling a deep sense of peace settle over her. The road ahead would not be without its challenges, but for the first time in a long while, she felt hopeful about the future. She stepped out of the room, closing the door quietly behind her. Miguel was waiting in the hallway, his hands in his pockets, a question in his eyes. "She's asleep," Leonita said, her voice soft but steady. Miguel nodded, and for a moment they simply stood there, two people who had once been worlds apart, now finding common ground in the love they shared for a little girl. "Thank you," Leonita said, breaking the silence. "For everything." Miguel shook his head. "No, Leonita. Thank you for giving me this chance." She smiled, a real, genuine smile, and for the first time it felt like they were truly beginning something new. As they walked back to the living room side by side, Leonita knew that whatever came next, they would face it together. They had become a family. Not perfect, not without its scars, but real, and filled with a love that was worth fighting for. And in that, there was hope. Thank you so much for joining me today as we journeyed through this powerful story of redemption, family, and the unexpected twists life can throw our way. It's stories like these that remind us of the resilience of the human spirit and the strength it takes to open the door to the past in order to build a brighter future. If this story touched your heart, make sure to hit that like button and share it with someone who might need a little light in their life today. And hey, if you haven't already, don't forget to subscribe so you never miss a new story. There's always more to uncover. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Stay inspired.